We had a very beautiful congregational explanation of what it means to honor your neighbor, and everyone contributed one idea of how we are to honor our neighbors. And today we move on to the last part of this hadith. Whoever believes in Allah on the last day, then let him honor his guest. So we're going to talk about how one honors one's guest. Just before doing so, we left one stone unturned last week talking about honoring the neighbors. And we actually did a very good job of gathering ideas as a community and looking at different perspectives of what some people would recommend as a way for you to honor your neighbor. And we've came out of that with some very beautiful reminders. Walhamdulillah. One thing remained, and that was that we failed to identify the importance of one issue connected to the topic, and that's not just your neighbor at your house, your neighbor at your workplace, your neighbor at the university or at your business, those around you. But there's another neighbor that we didn't talk about, that out of all neighbors, there has to be some very special significance given to this neighbor because of what he or she is a neighbor to. It's not just your house. It's not just a business. It's not just a Muslim. It's a congregation of Muslims. What am I talking about? The neighbors of the Masjid. So if Islam requires us to honor our neighbors throughout our day, at our business, at our house, neighborhoods and so on, what about our neighbors on Wiley Avenue, De Villers, Webster, Center? What about our neighbors around the Masjid? Do they deserve our kind treatment? Absolutely. Abdullah says, yes, of course they do. The neighbors of the Masjid, they're not the neighbor to one Muslim. They're a neighbor to hundreds of Muslims. So they should feel honored the way a neighbor to any Muslim is honored. There's a Muslim in your neighborhood, you should recognize. If you're a non-Muslim, you should recognize this person is special. He does things to honor you. He has a religious duty to do so. What happens when you put 100 of them together? Then that has to be more visible, more noticeable, more concentrated honoring with all of the Muslims that come and go from the Masjid. We have to honor our neighbors on a much higher level than what we would do near our houses. Why? Because we represent much more here. We don't represent here a man who lives next to you. We represent the house of worship when we come here to this place. So then we honor you as people who attend this house of worship as the neighbors of the best place on the face of the earth. What are the best places on earth? Masajid. Khairul biqa'i al-masajid. The very best places on earth, they are the masjids. So everything we said, individual ideas about how you can honor your neighbor, then all of that goes for the neighbors of the masjid even more so. It's something that, thinking about it, you say, yeah, that makes a lot of sense. The neighbors of the masjid should see a lot of good from the Muslims. They should be witnesses to say those are good people. They come together upon goodness, and they have good behavior, and they're upon a good religion. Very least that we could expect if we're practicing our religion is that we make an impact on those around us individually and especially when we come together. Especially. Right? Because one Muslim by himself, good behavior, bad behavior, he's not reinforced by his whole community all day and all night. When he comes to the masjid, his goodness is enhanced. He's on his best behavior at the house of Allah. Coming to it, approaching it. Our deen includes not only honoring the house of Allah, but honoring our approach to the house of Allah. How is that? Is it just that we worship Allah once we come in the door? And that before we approach the door, there's nothing connected to that? No. The Prophet ﷺ said, إِذَا سَمِعْتُمُ الْإِقَامَةَ فَلَا تَأْتُوهَا وَأَنْتُمْ تَسْعُونَ. If you hear the iqamah, then don't come to it, don't approach it running. You know, some people when the imam is in ruku', kick their shoes off and run, and you hear bang, 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 you hear the footsteps running. La, this is specifically forbidden. لا تأتوها وأنتم تسعون. Do not come to it, do not approach it running. Come to it walking and have tranquility as you walk. Walking with tranquility. Right? وَعِبَادُ الرَّحْمَنِ الَّذِينَ يَمْشُونَ عَلَى الْأَرْضِ هَوْنًا. The slave servants of Ar-Rahman, they're the people who walk upon earth calmly and with tranquility. Hawnan, easy and tranquil. So it's not befitting for someone to approach the masjid sloppy, hastily, carelessly, because he believes he's going to miss the prayer or any other reason. He approaches the masjid realizing that my approach to this place is part of my honoring that place and what is done in that place. So he approaches the masjid calmness with tranquility. Extend that a little bit more, and this is a very important thing for us to talk about, is how and where you park your car around the masjid, and how that affects the neighbors and their rights. In a residential neighborhood like this, parking spaces are important to the neighbors, aren't they? You live in a residential area, you know the spot in front of your house, you appreciate that for yourself. It's not a law that no one can park there. It's the street, it's government property. But culturally or customarily, you know in front of your house, amongst your neighbors, that's respected. That's known to be your spot. And it's not nice that you come to your house all the time and you see your neighbor has a party and he filled up the whole block and there are no spots for any of his neighbors. Such a person is annoying in the neighborhood. You come home and all the time your spot, there's some guest at that house parked in your spot all the time. So like you would be annoyed by that, what about the neighbors of the masjid? On Friday, on the Eid, on nights of Ramadan and times when we gather, should we be careless in where we park our car? Or should we think about the neighbors? We have options all around us here. That's the whole point of thinking about this. You have options. There are many streets around the masjid. Some streets are very residential, house after house, with just enough space for one or two cars in front of each house. Those should be avoided if you can. Avoid them. Park on the streets that have lots of space with very little housing. You have down on Wiley Avenue, generally lots of spaces available. People don't really care about those spaces. Am I right? The ones down that way, when you come out of the masjid to the right. We have our church parking lot, and there is an understanding of grace and kindness between us and the neighbors who are at that church, the Ebenezer Church on the corner. May Allah guide them. They allow us to use their parking area there when they don't need it. So, unless there's an event at the church, you're free to park there as well. On the street in front of the masjid, on the side streets, not in front of specifically anyone's house. Of course, without saying not in violation of state law, violation of laws that subject yourself to being ticketed, losing your money. You park in front of a fire hydrant or in the middle of a crosswalk or right at the intersection. Parking at the intersection, what does it do to our neighbors? When you park at the intersection, it makes it hard to navigate that turn. And someone might have to swing wide, and then he goes into oncoming traffic to swing wide around the corner because you parked right on the corner. It may lead to an accident. That's why the guidelines of the state laws for parking are you don't park at the corner, certain amount of feet. Anyone know? 15 feet or something? 15 feet from corners. Outside of crosswalks, within a certain distance of the crosswalks. Someone might say, this is petty. This is from the way we honor our neighbors. What happens when you park in a crosswalk? Is it just a violation? It's no big thing? Who could we be inconveniencing? Someone crossing the street? It's more than that. The handicapped. The weakest of your neighbors. Someone who's in a wheelchair. Or they have one of those carts and they get around on those carts. They need the crosswalk because that's the place where the sidewalk or the pavement dips down where they can roll from the sidewalk onto the street. And your car is parked there. Tell me that's not a mala'in. That's not an occasion for someone to say, damn this person, cursing that person. I'm a handicapped person. That's my opportunity right there to get from the sidewalk to the street. And this guy parks right in there in violation of the law. Double parking. Your Muslim brothers who are your neighbors at the masjid, blocking them in, saying we're all Muslims, we're all brothers, things like that. Not appropriate for someone who wishes to manifest his iman, his faith in Allah and the last day, of honoring his neighbor. Remember, neighbors are even your Muslim brothers at the masjid who attend the salat with you. They are your neighbors and they deserve your good treatment and your honor. Any other issues about neighbors of the masjid that we're neglecting? There are probably a lot in terms of da'wah, outreach. Some of the scholars mention in definition of the neighbor, whoever prays Fajr with you. And that's more along the lines of Muslim neighborhoods. You know, it's a Muslim country and every neighborhood has maybe a masjid or more than one masjid. So the ones that pray with you in your masjid for the 5 daily prayers, those are your neighbors. If we apply that here, what happens? A guy in McKeesport considers his neighbor to be a guy who lives in Wexford, and they're more than an hour away from each other driving. That's not really an applicable way to say that's a definition of a neighbor. But for sure, at the masjid, the people you mix with every day, the ones who you interact with, they have a right to good treatment from you and kindness. Whether they're part of your community or whether they come from another masjid. They're in the masjid with you, interacting closely with you, then neighborly rights are applied. And you don't say about that person, well, he's not from Green Tree like me, so he doesn't get neighborly rights. No, he interacts with you on a close level of interaction, praying at your side, so he deserves good treatment as a neighbor as well. And Allah Ta'ala knows best.